Hello, everyone. Here are the 10 biggest wars in world history in 500 words each. Number 10. The Crusades were a series of religious and military campaigns sanctioned by the Catholic Church, primarily against Muslim forces in the Holy Land, but also against other perceived enemies of Christianity such as heretics and pagans. For 2 centuries, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the Crusades had significant religious, political, and cultural consequences for Europe and the Middle East. Here is a summary of the Crusades in 500 words. Background. The roots of the Crusades can be traced back to the 11th century, when the Byzantine Empire, the Christian successor to the Roman Empire in the East, appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, who had captured Jerusalem and threatened the Christians. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a holy war, known as the First Crusade, to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. The First Crusade was launched in 1096 and attracted thousands of knights, soldiers, and peasants from Western Europe. Despite numerous challenges, including internal divisions and hostile Muslim forces, the Crusaders achieved a notable victory with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders founded several Latin Christian states in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Later Crusades. Over the next 2 centuries, a series of additional crusades were launched, with varying degrees of success. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, aimed to strengthen the Christian presence in the Holy Land, but ended in failure with the defeat of the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, led by European monarchs including Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, attempted to retake Jerusalem but ultimately resulted in a truce with Saladin. Later Crusades and decline. Subsequent Crusades, including the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, which famously resulted in the sack of Constantinople, seat of the Byzantine Empire, and the ill-fated Children's Crusade, 1212, in which thousands of young people died in their attempts to conquer the Holy Land, failed to achieve their objectives. The later Crusades were characterized by declining support from European rulers, internal conflict, and rivalry between Crusader factions. Legacy and impact. The Crusades had significant religious, political, and cultural consequences for both Europe and the Middle East. While the Crusaders initially sought to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control, the Crusades also had unintended consequences, including the spread of violence, intolerance, and religious persecution. The Crusades promoted cultural exchanges between Europe and the Middle East, introduced Europeans to new ideas, technologies, and goods, and contributed to the rise of trade and commerce in the Mediterranean. Long-term consequences. Although the Crusades ultimately failed to achieve their primary objectives of permanently establishing Christian control over the Holy Land, they left a lasting legacy in the collective memory of Western and Eastern societies. The Crusades contributed. Number 9. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the largest and deadliest rebellions in Chinese history, lasting from 1850 to 1864. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil servant who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the rebellion attempted to Taiping Heavenly to establish Kingdom, a utopian society based on Christian principles and social reform. Here is a summary of the Taiping Rebellion in 500 words. Background. The Taiping Rebellion emerged in the mid-19th century against the backdrop of social, economic, and political unrest in China's Qing dynasty. The Qing government faced internal unrest, foreign attacks, and widespread corruption, exacerbating popular discontent among the peasantry, who suffered from poverty, famine, and oppression. Hong Xiuquan and the Heavenly Kingdom. The rebellion was sparked by Hong Xiuquan, a Hakka Chinese from Guangdong Province, who claimed to have had visions and dreams in which he was instructed to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a heavenly kingdom based on his interpretation of Christianity. Hong's message resonated with many disenfranchised farmers who were attracted to the promise of social equality, land reform, and redemption. Outbreak of rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion began in 1850 in Guangxi Province, where Hong Xiuquan and his followers launched an armed uprising against the Qing government. The rebels quickly gained momentum and expanded their control over large parts of southern China, including the important city of Nanjing, which they declared their capital. Taiping ideology and reforms. The Heavenly Kingdom of Taiping embraced a radical ideology that blended elements of Christianity, Confucianism, and traditional Chinese beliefs. Hong Xiuquan declared himself the Heavenly King and introduced sweeping social reforms, including the abolition of private property, communal land ownership, gender equality, and the banning of opium, foot binding, and other social vices. Military campaigns. The Taiping Rebellion was characterized by large-scale military campaigns and fierce fighting between the Taiping forces and the Qing Imperial Army. The rebels employed innovative military tactics, including the use of disciplined infantry, artillery, and siege warfare. Despite initial successes, the Taiping forces faced formidable resistance from the Qing army, which launched counter-offensives to regain lost territory. Foreign involvement. The Taiping Rebellion attracted international attention and foreign involvement, especially from Western powers and Christian missionaries sympathetic to the Taiping cause. However, the Qing government also sought foreign assistance to suppress the rebellion. British and French forces intervened on behalf of the Qing dynasty, contributing military advisors, weapons, and financial support to strengthen the imperial army. Decline and fall. Despite their early successes, the Taiping rebels faced internal divisions, leadership conflicts, and logistical challenges that weakened their movement. The Qing government, aided by foreign intervention and internal reforms, gradually regained control of the rebel-held areas. The turning point came in 1864 when Qing forces retook Nanjing, the rebel capital, after a lengthy siege. Hong Xiuquan died shortly before the city fell, marking the end of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Legacy and consequences. The Taiping Rebellion had profound and far-reaching consequences for China. It resulted in staggering loss of life, with an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in history. The rebellion also weakened the Qing dynasty and contributed to its eventual collapse in 1912. Furthermore, the rebellion highlighted the need for social and political reform in China, paving the way for subsequent movements and revolutions in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Despite its ultimate failure, the Taiping Rebellion remains an important chapter in Chinese history, symbolizing the struggle for social justice, religious freedom, and national renewal. Number 8. The Russian Revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War were pivotal events in Russian history that fundamentally reshaped the country's political, social, and economic landscape. Here's a summary of these events in 500 words. Background. By the early 20th century, Russia was ruled by the autocratic Romanov dynasty, which faced widespread discontent due to economic hardship, social inequality, and political repression. Russia's involvement in World War I further exacerbated these tensions, leading to widespread dissatisfaction among the population. February Revolution, 1917. The February Revolution of 1917 began as a series of spontaneous protests and strikes in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, over bread shortages and deteriorating living conditions. The protests quickly escalated into a mass movement calling for an end to the Tsarist regime. Facing mounting pressure, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 15, 1917, bringing an end to over 300 years of Romanov rule, provisional government, and dual power. Following the abdication of the Tsar, a provisional government composed of liberal and moderate socialist factions took power, promising democratic reforms and an end to autocracy. However, real power also rested with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies, which competed with the provisional government for authority. This period of dual power saw political instability and continued social unrest. October Revolution, 1917. In October 1917, November in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution known as the October Revolution. Capitalizing on widespread disillusionment with the provisional government's policies and the ongoing war, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd and established Soviet control over key institutions. The October Revolution marked the beginning of Bolshevik rule and the establishment of a socialist state in Russia. Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. The Bolshevik seizure of power triggered a civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and their opponents, known as the Whites, who were composed of a diverse array of anti-Bolshevik forces, including monarchists, liberals, and foreign interventionists. The Civil War was fought across the vast expansion of the former Russian Empire and involved mass mobilization, guerrilla warfare, and foreign intervention. Key phases of the Civil War. The Civil War can be divided into several key phases, including the initial struggle between the Reds and the Whites, the formation of anti-Bolshevik white governments in various regions, foreign military intervention by countries such as Britain, France, Japan, and the United States in support of the Whites, and the consolidation of Bolshevik power under Lenin and Trotsky. Bolshevik victory and establishment of the Soviet Union. Despite facing significant challenges, including internal dissent, economic collapse, and foreign intervention, the Bolsheviks ultimately emerged victorious in the Civil War. The Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky, succeeded in defeating the White armies and consolidating Bolshevik control over the entire territory of the former Russian Empire. In 1922, the Bolsheviks formally established the Soviet Union, a federation of socialist republics, with Lenin as its leader. Legacy. The Russian Revolution and Civil War had far-reaching consequences for Russia and the world. They led to the establishment of the world's first socialist state, the Soviet Union, which would go on to play a significant role in 20th-century global politics. The revolution also unleashed waves of social and cultural change, including land reform, nationalization of industry, and the promotion of education and literacy. However, it also resulted in widespread repression, political purges, and human rights abuses under the Stalinist regime. The Russian Revolution and Civil War continue to be subjects of historical debate and analysis, with their legacy still felt in contemporary Russia and beyond. Number 7. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in United States history. It was a conflict between the northern states, known as the Union, and the southern states, known as the Confederacy, primarily over issues of slavery, states' rights, and the preservation of the Union. Here's a summary of the American Civil War in 500 words. Background. Tensions between the North and South had been escalating for decades prior to the outbreak of war. The issue of slavery was a central point of contention, with southern states relying on slave labor for their agrarian economy, while northern states increasingly embraced abolitionist sentiments. Additionally, disputes over states' rights versus federal authority, economic differences, and political polarization further divided the nation. Election of Abraham Lincoln. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, representing the anti-slavery Republican Party, was a catalyst for secession. Southern states viewed Lincoln's election as a threat to their way of life and feared federal interference with their institution of slavery. In response, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860, followed by 6 other southern states, forming the Confederate States of America. Fort Sumter and outbreak of war. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces bombarded the Union-held fort. The attack prompted President Lincoln to call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion, leading to the mobilization of Northern forces and the formal outbreak of war. Military campaigns. The Civil War saw a series of military campaigns and battles fought across the United States. Major theaters of war included the Eastern Theater, where Union and Confederate armies clashed in Virginia, and the Western Theater, which encompassed battles in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. The war also saw naval engagements, such as the Union blockade of southern ports and the Battle of Hampton Roads, where ironclad warships revolutionized naval warfare. Emancipation Proclamation. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. While the proclamation did not immediately end slavery, It signaled a significant shift in the Union's war aims and paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery in the United States. Gettysburg and Turning Point. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in July 1863 in Pennsylvania, was a turning point in the war. It marked a major Union victory and dealt a severe blow to Confederate hopes for victory in the North. The battle also resulted in staggering casualties on both sides, with over 50,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Sherman's March and Appomattox. In 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his famous March to the Sea, a campaign of total war aimed at destroying the Confederate economy and morale. Sherman's forces devastated Georgia and South Carolina, leading to the eventual surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. The surrender effectively ended the Civil War, although scattered fighting continued for several weeks. Reconstruction and legacy. The end of the Civil War marked the beginning of Reconstruction, a period of rebuilding and reconciliation in the United States. The war's legacy included the abolition of slavery, the preservation of the Union, and the expansion of federal authority. However, the war also resulted in immense human suffering, with over 600,000 soldiers killed and countless civilians displaced or harmed. The scars of the Civil War lingered for generations, shaping American society and politics for years to come. Number 6. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of conflicts between the French Empire, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, and various coalitions of European powers from 1803 to 1815. These wars had far-reaching consequences for Europe and the world, changing political boundaries, social structures, and took shape again. And international relations. Here is a summary of the Napoleonic Wars in 500 words. Background. The Napoleonic Wars arose in the wake of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to power. A brilliant military commander, Napoleon became first consul of France in 1799 and later proclaimed himself emperor in 1804. His ambitious expansionist policies and desire for hegemony over Europe led to a series of conflicts with other European powers. War of the Third Coalition, 1803 to 1806. The Napoleonic Wars officially began with the War of the Third Coalition in 1803, following Napoleon's decision to restore French control over Europe. The coalition, consisting of Britain, Austria, Russia, and others, attempted to curb French expansionism. The war culminated in Napoleon's decisive victories at the Battle of Austerlitz, 1805, and the Treaty of Pressburg, 1805, which forced Austria to make peace and led to the dissolution of the Third Coalition.
Peninsular war 1808 bis 1814.
One of the main theaters of the Napoleonic Wars was the Iberian Peninsula, where Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 led to a popular uprising known as the Peninsular War. Spanish guerrilla resistance, combined with British military intervention led by the Duke of Wellington, trapped large numbers of French troops and drained French resources. The Peninsular War weakened Napoleon's hold on Europe and contributed to his eventual downfall. War of the Fourth Coalition, 1806 to 1807. During the War of the Fourth Coalition, Napoleon triumphed over Prussia at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt, 1806, and the Confederation of the Rhine was established, a coalition of German states allied with France. However, Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, characterized by the brutal Russian winter and the scorched earth tactics of the Russian army, resulted in catastrophic losses for the French Grand Army. War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809. During the War of the Fifth Coalition, Napoleon clashed again with Austria. Despite initial Austrian successes, Napoleon defeated the Austrian army at the Battle of Wagram, 1809, and forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Schönbrunn, which resulted in further territorial losses for Austria and strengthened French dominance in Central Europe. Invasion of Russia, 1812. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 proved to be a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. Despite initial French advances, the Russian strategy of withdrawal and scorched earth tactics weakened the French army. The devastating Russian winter, coupled with supply shortages and guerrilla attacks, decimated Napoleon's forces. The withdrawal from Russia marked the beginning of Napoleon's decline and the erosion of French military power. War of the Sixth Coalition, 1812 to 1814. The defeat in Russia prompted a coalition of European powers, including Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain to rise again against Napoleon. The War of the Sixth Coalition saw a series of decisive battles, including the Battle of Leipzig, 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, where Napoleon suffered a crushing defeat. The coalition forces advanced into France, culminating in the capture of Paris in 1814 and Napoleon's abdication. 100 Days in Waterloo, 1815. Napoleon's return from exile on the island of Elba in 1815, known as the 100 Days, reignited the conflict. However, his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815 by British and Prussian forces commanded by the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon was then exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. Legacy. The Napoleonic Wars brought significant changes to Europe, including the redrawing of political boundaries, the collapse of old empires, and the spread of nationalism. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to restore stability in Europe and establish a new balance of power. The legacy of the Napoleonic Wars continues to influence European politics and international relations to this day. Number 5. The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, was a protracted conflict that took place from 1955 to 1975. It involved the communist government of North Vietnam and its allies in the South, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. Here's a summary of the Vietnam War in 500 words. Background. The Vietnam War had its roots in the struggle for Vietnamese independence and the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. After World War II, Vietnam, a former French colony, was divided into North Vietnam, governed by the Communist Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other anti-communist allies. First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. The Vietnam War was preceded by the First Indochina War, fought between the Viet Minh and the French colonial forces. The war ended with the Geneva Accords of 1954, which partitioned Vietnam along the 17th parallel and called for elections to reunify the country. However, the elections were never held, leading to the establishment of separate governments in the North and South. Escalation. The Vietnam War escalated in the early 1960s as the United States became increasingly involved in supporting the South Vietnamese government against communist insurgency. The U.S. provided military advisors, financial assistance, and weapons to the South Vietnamese army. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where U.S. naval vessels were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, led to the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the use of military force in Vietnam. Military operations. The Vietnam War was characterized by a combination of conventional warfare, guerrilla tactics, and counterinsurgency operations. The U.S. military conducted large-scale bombing campaigns, including Operation Rolling Thunder, aimed at destroying North Vietnamese infrastructure and disrupting supply routes. In addition, ground operations, such as search and destroy missions and strategic hamlet programs, were conducted to combat Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam.
Tet Offensive, 1968.
One of the turning points of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in January 1968. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the offensive demonstrated the resilience of the communist forces and shook public confidence in the U.S. government's claims of progress in the war. The Tet Offensive led to increased anti-war sentiment in the United States and fueled opposition to the war effort. Anti-war movement. The Vietnam War sparked a massive anti-war movement in the United States and around the world. Protests, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience became widespread, with millions of people calling for an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The anti-war movement played a significant role in shaping public opinion and pressuring policymakers to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Vietnamization and withdrawal. In the early 1970s, the Nixon administration pursued a policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually transfer responsibility for combat operations to the South Vietnamese army while reducing U.S. troop levels. As part of this strategy, U.S. troops were gradually withdrawn from Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, signed by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. Fall of Saigon, 1975. Despite the ceasefire agreement, fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces continued. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a major offensive, quickly capturing the capital city of Saigon and effectively ending the Vietnam War. The fall of Saigon marked the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule and the end of U.S. involvement in the conflict. Legacy. The Vietnam War had profound and far-reaching consequences for Vietnam, the United States, and the world. It resulted in millions of deaths, widespread destruction, and lasting trauma for the people of Vietnam. In the United States, the war led to deep divisions in society and a crisis of confidence in government institutions. The Vietnam War also influenced U.S. foreign policy and military strategy for decades to come, shaping subsequent conflicts and interventions in the post-Cold War era. Number 4. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most destructive and complex conflicts in European history. It began as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, but evolved into a broader struggle for political power and territorial dominance among European states. Here is a summary of the 30 Years' War in 500 words. Causes of the war. The roots of the 30 Years' War can be traced back to the religious and political tensions that arose in Europe after the Protestant Reformation. The Peace of Augsburg of 1555 had granted German princes the right to choose between Lutheranism and Catholicism for their territory, but did not respect the religious rights of the Calvinists. As Calvinism gained ground, tensions between Catholics and Protestants escalated, leading to outbreaks of violence. Bohemian Revolt, 1618 to 1625. The 30 Years' War began in 1618 with the Bohemian Uprising, sparked by the defenestration of Prague, in which Protestant nobles threw Catholic officials out the window. This event sparked an uprising against the Habsburg rulers of Bohemia, leading to the election of Frederick V, Elector Palatine, as the new king of Bohemia. However, Frederick's forces were defeated by the Catholic League at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, leading to his exile and the restoration of Catholic rule in Bohemia.
Danish Intervention, 1625-1629.
The conflict expanded with the intervention of Denmark, led by King Christian IV, who sought to support the Protestant forces and challenge the growing power of the Habsburgs. The Danish intervention initially met with some success, but was ultimately defeated by imperial and Catholic forces led by the famous General Albrecht von Wallenstein. The Peace of Lübeck in 1629 marked the end of Danish involvement in the war and confirmed Catholic dominance in Northern Europe. Swedish phase, 1630 to 1635. The Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War began with the intervention of Sweden, led by King Gustavus Adolphus. Sweden, a Protestant power, entered the war in support of the Protestant cause and to challenge the dominance of the Habsburgs in the Baltic region. Gustavus Adolphus won several notable victories against imperial forces, but his death at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632 weakened the Swedish position. The war continued to rage in Central Europe, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. French intervention, 1635 to 1648. The conflict escalated further with the intervention of France, led by Cardinal Richelieu. Although France was a Catholic nation, Richelieu saw an opportunity to weaken the Habsburgs, France's traditional rival, by supporting Protestant powers such as Sweden and several German states. The French intervention prolonged the war and shifted the balance of power in Europe. The war finally came to an end with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic and Switzerland and reaffirmed the principle of Curius Regio, Ius Religio, whose empire, its religion, of the Peace of Augsburg, thus German princes could keep their freedom, determine the religion of their territory. Legacy. The 30 Years' War had a profound and lasting impact on Europe. It resulted in widespread destruction, depopulation, and economic ruin across Central Europe, with estimates of millions of deaths from battle, disease, and famine. The war also marked the decline of the Holy Roman Empire and the rise of France and Sweden as dominant powers in Europe. The Peace of Westphalia established the principles of state sovereignty and religious tolerance, laying the foundation for modern international diplomacy. However, the war left deep scars on European society and contributed to centuries of religious and political conflict. And now the top 3. The First World War, also called the Great War, was a global conflict that lasted from 1914 to 1918 and involved many of the world's major powers. The reason for this was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Here is a summary of the First World War in 500 words. Causes of the war. The causes of the First World War are complex and multifaceted, rooted in a combination of long-term structural factors and immediate triggers. These include militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. The arms race between European powers, the system of alliances, and imperial competition for colonies all contributed to the rising tensions in the years leading up to the war. Outbreak of war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist set off a chain reaction of events that led to the outbreak of war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, leading to a series of alliances that drew other major powers into the conflict. Within weeks, much of Europe was embroiled in war. Western Front. The Western Front, characterized by trench warfare, became the main battlefield of the First World War. It stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border and saw brutal battles such as the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun, and the Battle of Passchendaele. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but little territory changed hands. Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, Germany and Austria-Hungary faced Russia. It was characterized by large-scale offensives and counteroffensives, including the Battle of Tannenberg and the Brusilov Offensive. Russia's early defeats and internal turmoil eventually led to its withdrawal from the war.
Naval war.
Naval warfare played an important role in World War I, especially in the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The British Royal Navy imposed a naval blockade on Germany, cutting off vital supplies and resources. Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare, including the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, led to tensions with the United States. Global conflict. The First World War was not limited to Europe. It was truly a global conflict. Battles were fought in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, leading to campaigns in the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Middle East. Colonial forces from around the world were also mobilized to fight on behalf of their colonial rulers. War of attrition. The First World War quickly became a war of attrition, with both sides on the Western Front in a stalemate. Trench warfare, barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery led to many casualties and little territorial gain. The war dragged on for years and took a heavy toll on both soldiers and civilians. Entry into the United States. The United States initially maintained its neutrality in World War I, but German submarine attacks on American ships and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States, prompted America's participation in the war in April 1917. The arrival of new American troops strengthened the Allied war effort. End of the war. In 1918, the tide of war began to turn in the Allies' favor. The German spring offensives were halted and a series of successful Allied counteroffensives pushed the Central Powers back. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary all surrendered, leading to Germany's armistice on November 11, 1918. Treaty of Versailles. The war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. The treaty imposed severe penalties on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations. It also established the League of Nations, an international organization aimed at preventing future conflicts. In short, World War I was a devastating conflict that reshaped the political, social, and economic landscape of the world. It led to the collapse of empires, the redrawing of national borders, and the rise of new world powers. The legacy of the war is still felt today and serves as a cautionary tale of the horrors of war and the importance of diplomacy in solving. Number 2. The Mongol conquests, which spanned from the early 13th to the mid-14th centuries, were a series of military campaigns led by the Mongol Empire led by figures such as Genghis Khan and his successors. These conquests resulted in the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Eastern Europe to East Asia, and profoundly influenced the course of world history. Here is a summary of the Mongol conquests in about 500 words. Origin and rise of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were a nomadic pastoral people who inhabited the vast steppes of Central Asia. In the early 13th century, the Mongols, led by Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united several nomadic tribes through a combination of diplomacy, warfare, and political cunning. Genghis Khan's military genius and organizational reforms turned the Mongols into a formidable fighting force. Conquests in Asia. From the early 13th century, Genghis Khan launched a series of military campaigns to expand Mongol power in Asia. The Mongols conquered the Shi. Subsequent campaigns targeted the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, 1219 to 1221, and the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, 1258, bringing large parts of Asia under Mongol rule. Strategies and tactics. The Mongols used a combination of strategic brilliance, military innovation, and psychological warfare to defeat their enemies. They were skilled horsemen and archers who used the composite bow with deadly accuracy. Mongol tactics included feigned withdrawals, encirclement maneuvers, and psychological intimidation, such as using terror tactics to instill fear in their enemies and encourage surrender. Administration and governance. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, the Mongols were also effective administrators and governors. Genghis Khan implemented a system of meritocracy, where officials were appointed based on competence rather than birthright. The Mongols built an extensive network of roads and lines of communication known as the Silk Road, facilitating trade and cultural exchange across their empire. Legacy and impact. The Mongol conquests had profound and lasting consequences for the regions they conquered and for the course of world history. The Mongol Empire facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West, and contributed to the flourishing of trade and commerce during the Pax Mongolica. However, the Mongols also brought devastation and destruction to many regions, leading to the depopulation of cities and the spread of disease. Decline and successor states. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, leading to the formation of several successor states, including the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These successor states continued to exert influence in their respective regions for centuries, but internal conflict, external pressure, and cultural assimilation eventually led to their decline. Assimilation and cultural inheritance. Despite their reputation as conquerors, the Mongols also adopted and assimilated aspects of the cultures they encountered. They embraced religious tolerance, allowed the practice of different religions within their empire, and patronized the arts, literature, and science. The Mongol Empire served as a bridge between East and West, facilitating the exchange of ideas and technologies that would shape the course of world history for centuries. In short, the Mongol conquests were a transformative force in world history, establishing one of the largest and most influential empires the world has ever seen. The military prowess, administrative innovations, and cultural legacy of the Mongols continue to resonate today, leaving an indelible mark on the regions they conquered and on the course of human civilization. And then number one, if you haven't already guessed, World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, was a global conflict that engulfed much of the world, resulting in immense destruction, loss of life, and far-reaching geopolitical consequences. The war was fought between two major alliances, the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, and the Allied powers, including the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and China, among others. Here is a summary of World War II in about 500 words. Causes and prediction. The roots of World War II can be traced to the aftermath of World War I, where the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, economic instability, and unresolved territorial disputes fueled resentment and nationalism in Europe. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, together with the expansionist ambitions of Japan and Italy, further destabilized the international order. Outbreak of war. The war officially started on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. This act of aggression prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, marking the start of hostilities in Europe. In the following years, Germany quickly conquered much of Western Europe, while Japan expanded its empire in the Pacific through a series of military campaigns. Axis power expansion and Allied response. As the Axis powers expanded their territories, the Allied powers mobilized to resist the aggression. During the Battle of Britain, 1940, the Royal Air Force repelled German air attacks, preventing a German invasion of the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the United States pursued a policy of neutrality but provided material support to the Allies through programs such as Lend-Lease. Turning points. Several key events changed the momentum of the war in favor of the Allies. The Soviet Union's resilience in the face of the brutal German invasion during Operation Barbarossa, 1941, created a costly stalemate on the Eastern Front. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 prompted the United States to enter the war, leading to a united Allied front against the Axis powers. Main campaigns. The Second World War saw a series of major military campaigns in multiple war zones. In Europe, the Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. In the Pacific, battles such as Midway, 1942, and Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943, turned the tide against Japan, ultimately leading to defeat. Holocaust and atrocities. One of the darkest chapters of World War II was the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazi regime. Concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau became symbols of human suffering and the horrors of war. Furthermore, both the Axis and Allied powers committed atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war during the conflict. Victory and legacy. The war culminated in the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945 and Japan in September 1945, following the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II resulted in more than 70 million deaths, including civilians and military personnel, and left much of Europe and Asia in ruins. The war's legacy included the creation of the United Nations, the outbreak of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and major geopolitical realignments that shaped the post-war world order. In short, World War II was a defining moment in human history, marked by unprecedented levels of violence, suffering, and heroism. Its impact is still felt today and reminds us of the importance of international cooperation, diplomacy, and the preservation of peace. And now knows what the 10 biggest wars in world history were. Like and subscribe for more content like this.